We realized
And you couldn't get up. So
we could, yeah, and then we were like, what? And then immediately just stupid. It's like everyone that's a guy. Like it turns out in Germany on the North Sea, something. It sounds like kind of World War II.
It does, but I can almost picture.
Yeah. This is super impressive.
It's remarkable. I mean, this is nice.
I like the entrance.
Yes, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a great place.
And a lot of the new, I noticed, Kellogg has kind of Chicago GMP is always got a really building. Kellogg, yeah, it's shaped like a tank. Yeah, I didn't know. If you look at it on Google Earth, Google Maps, yeah, it's a bit hilarious, but it is quite a fun. And so, here's the plan. We go down the
Good plan, man.
Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah. So we sit. I thought it's going to be a big flop.
I just wanted to share.
Gosh, it's not a step up there. We just got one. The rest of it. Oh, really? Which bit?
Almost 5 o'clock. Yes. What? Yeah, I know. Hot one. Well, good afternoon to all of you. My name is Debashish Pal, and I'm the head of the Department of Economics. I'm here to welcome you all. Thank you very much for being here. Today, we have our 2019 James C. Kautz annual lecture, and we have a great speaker. We'll hear from him. This lecture is sponsored by Taft Research Center and Kautz-Weibull Economics Institute. Now, Kautz-Weibull Economics Institute, it was started by one of our alumni, James C. Kautz, and his wife, Caroline Kautz. At that time, it was known as Hewitt-Kautz Fund. And Hewitt was Jim's favorite economics professor, and to honor him, he created that fund. And over time, the fund grew. From Hewitt-Kautz Fund, it became Kautz-Weibull Fund, and today it is going to be Kautz-Weibull Economics Institute. Now, you might wonder, what do we do? You have this brochure. Look at the very back page. and you would get amazed all the things that we do. And our mission is very clear. We are student-focused, faculty-driven, alumni and friends assisted. So whatever we do it for our students. Now, Jim passed away last year, and what you would see that his legacy will continue with so many students and faculty he supported. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of students who got supported by this fund, one way or other, through scholarships, lectures, and many different ways they got support. So today, I would like to recognize a few very special people here. Woody Weibel. Woody is here, you can see that. Dan Kautz, Leslie Kautz, Alice Cunningham, Penny Kautz, and Lucas Kautz, and the entire Kautz family. So thank you very much. Then comes all the people who made significant contribution one way or other with this fund. They are, and I can see many of them here, Amanda Waite, she's right over here. Nick Panser, Nick is here. Nandita Jaina, where is Nandita? She got lost somewhere. Yeah, there is Nandita. Thank you. Gigi Esco, is Gigi here? No, Gigi is not here. Am I missing anyone? Richard Curry? No, Richard is not here. If I'm missing someone from the Board of Trustees of the Kautz Weibel Fund, please raise your hand. No, I don't think I'm missing anyone. Thank you. Then I also want to recognize Michael Jones. He's the Executive Director of the Kautz Weibel Economics Institute. All the terrific economics faculty and all of our students who have received Kautz Weibel Economics Fellowship. So that's great. And finally, I would like to recognize a couple of our former department heads who made significant contribution to the fund, Surush Zanvakili. Thank you, Surush. And Professor Joe Gallo. Joe told me he would be here, but I can't see him. Joe is right over there. And I like Joe because he hired me. And that was back in 1994, Joe hired me. And I feel that's the best decision he made in his lifetime. See, he agrees. Thank you, Joe. And thanks to everyone. And now I would introduce our Dean, Marianne Lewis. And she's our new Dean starting this year. And Marianne would like to welcome you and say a few words. Thank you, Marianne. Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Tonight is really a powerful reminder of the potential, and I'll repeat, the power of community. And I don't know that we have a better model in this college than our economics community. And if you ask why, I would say it is that remarkable combination of faculty, alumni, and students working together. And an event like this, also the panel we had yesterday, I could see some of our panelists, that it's about also continuously learning and pushing each other with new insights and new challenges. And I will also welcome you to this beautiful new building, which is a new home that we can also enable that community to thrive with events like this evening. I won't repeat the many names that Debashis just shared with you, but I would like to reiterate a bit that that community was started with a powerful combination of alumni and faculty with Hewitt and Kautz. And that legacy is palpable now because you can feel it. It just continues to grow with the expanded board that we have now, with members like the alumni who spoke yesterday, but with so many of the fellows who are here today. Can I see hands of everyone who has been a fellow in the past or today? I mean, wonderful, wonderful to see you here. And I know that your futures were enabled so much by the opportunities and continued support of this community. If I could add one more thanks, and I think, Debashis, you started to share it, but when you think about a community like this, leadership is critical to keep it moving. I mean, this is a virtuous, sustainable cycle, but one of the reasons is the strength of leadership. And I believe we might have maybe all of the department heads that really drove this. Do we have Wolfgang here? Wolfgang Mayer? Wolfgang? Oh, he's not here. Oh, he is here. Where are you, Wolfgang? Stand up. Wolfgang? Okay, stay standing, Wolfgang. Wolfgang? Sarush Zambakili, please stand. Please stand. Joe is also, correct? Joe, please. Nick Williams and Debashis, please. Can we give them a huge round of applause because they're so critical to how this has developed. Thank you. What a rare opportunity to have you all together. So thank you. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Woody Eberle to tell you a bit more about tonight's lecture, but also our very special guest speaker. So thank you, Woody.
Nick Bloom has done some amazing, fabulous research. And I looked him up a few months ago when I heard about the speaker, and I saw that he had done some really great research into the benefits of working remotely. So I invited the president of the company I work for to be here tonight, Bartlett Wealth Management. And unfortunately, she could not be here because I really wanted to hear what she had to say about that. As it turns out, you're actually talking about something else. So let me just step right in and tell you a little bit about Dr. Bloom. He is the William Eberle Professor of Economics at Stanford, and he is the co-director of Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He focuses on management practices, and he has previously been at the UK Treasury and McKinsey & Company. He has won numerous prizes and awards, as shown in your program. He has a bachelor's from Cambridge, a master's from Oxford, and a PhD from the University College of London. And welcome to the Oxford and Cambridge of Ohio. So please join me in giving Dr. Bloom a very warm welcome. You're already welcome.
So thank you very much. I'm very honored, extremely happy to be here. I've enjoyed, I should say, Marion and I were talking at the business school. It's amazing. It looks really incredible. I love the open space. It's been a great day. In case you're impatient to know the answer, the question is, are American companies badly managed? The answer is no. I guess, definitely not. You can go home at this point if you just wanted the quick one-liner. I wanted to remove any suspense in case it was stressing everyone out. But, for those of you that decided to stay, why don't I proceed? So American managers are under fire. They're under fire on the left, which has been a kind of an old theme. But, for example, here's Bernie Sanders unveiling his inequality tax. There's a number of politicians on the left that have taken aim, particularly at CEOs, but senior managers, arguing they are the drivers of rising inequality and their kind of profit, rent extracting from their firms. And some extent, more worryingly, recently, the right has followed suit. So, in fact, I don't know how many of you noticed it, but about a month ago, President Trump put out a tweet arguing that the slowdown in manufacturing we're seeing was not due to the tariffs, but was due to bad management of American companies. So, no talk can be complete without a reference to President Trump, but at this point, I'm not going to discuss politics anymore. What I'm going to do is say there's actually an amazingly long history of work on management. So this is a paper from the Quarterly Journal of Economics. It's actually the oldest journal in economics, and I think possibly in social science, I'm not sure, but it was founded in 1887. So this came out in the first year. It's the Harvard-MIT
journal. It's still maybe the leading journal in economics. And in it, this character Walker argues that the variation in business performance is driven primarily by management. So who was Walker? This was Francis Walker, who's actually the founding president of the American Economics Association. As in all of these really old photos, they look extremely unhappy. I think he looks unhappy because he appears to actually be ironing his trousers while he's wearing them. So I think I would be too. You know, it's like pro tip: if you're going to iron your clothes, take them off before you iron them. But in terms of why Walker's here, Walker ran the 1870 and 1880 census, the economic census and decennial census in the US. So he interviewed thousands and thousands of, you know, his team, hundreds of thousands of businesses. And based on that, he wrote his paper. And he claimed that management practices were the major source of performance differences across firms. So I'd say there's still huge debate about this. I've been teaching at Stanford and before that at LSE in London for many years. And there's always debate in the classroom amongst MBAs, exec head, actually particularly amongst policymakers over it. And I put up a quote here from Chad Syverson. He wrote, "No potential driving factor of productivity has seen a higher ratio of speculation to empirical study." And what I think he means is there's an amazing amount of valuable literature, but often it's based on smaller samples, case studies, which are fantastic for teaching. So I always use case studies for teaching, but it's less clear how much we can draw large generalizations. So there's a question about, is there really big data and management? And I took this photo actually on the flight before I took off in San Francisco airport. There's a picture of the management section of the airport bookstore. And it kind of supports this in the sense that you can see there are books about Steve Jobs. There are multiple books about Steve Jobs. There's a book about Richard Branson, presumably Howard Schultz at Starbucks, about Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. Who else can we see? A whole series of IKEA, etc. So in some senses, these books are often focused around mostly one individual, suggesting that this is, you know, that we should learn from this individual. It always makes me a bit worried. For example, Steve Jobs, living out in Silicon Valley, many people think about Steve Jobs and compare themselves to Steve Jobs. On the other hand, he was famous for his, reality distortion field, which is never taking no for an answer. He was also famously tough on people around him, and it's not entirely clear that this is the way we want to lead. And, you know, I'm going to use my own personal experience, which is when I was at McKinsey, I joined McKinsey in 2000, and we had this 3-week mini MBA. So if any of the undergrads or MBAs joined McKinsey, I actually came from an econ PhD. So I didn't have an MBA, and for any of the intake in McKinsey that don't have MBAs, you put them through this 3-week mini MBA. It's a fantastic training course. So if you do have an MBA and can keep quiet about it, I'll give that advice. So one of the things they spent a long time gushing about was Enron, which at the time was a major client and very successful. And of course, you know, within my time at the firm, a year later, Enron had gone bankrupt, and now the symbol has been replaced by this. So I'm going to talk about what I've been doing along with a number of co-authors. I put them on the front slide, but particularly John Banrini and Rafael Asadun, Hanata Limos, Daniel Lasker, but also with collaborators in McKinsey and Accenture, the World Bank, a whole range of institutions to try and bring basically big data to management. So I'll tell you how we measure management. I'll then tell you about some basic facts. I'll then tell you some facts related to management inequality. Inequality is kind of, you know, slowing growth and rising inequality seem to be the big topics at the moment in terms of economics. And finally, I'll talk about how we might want to improve management. So how do we measure management? There's 3 steps, and I wrote this up in an academic paper. I'm just going to go through this, and you know, I promise no equations at all today. So just go through this in 3 steps in words. So the first thing is we came up with a scorecard. Where did this come from? So this is a scorecard which has 18 questions around monitoring, targets, and people practices. So the monitoring is, do you evaluate what's going on, let's say in a factory? Do you have feedback systems? Are you evaluating the information? Are you using it to improve things? Targets is, do you have targets? Does the short and the long run add together? Are they not too hard, not too easy, but about right? And then finally, on people practices, do good performers get rewarded and promoted? Does something happen about underperformance? For example, do they get feedback? Do they get retrained? And do they get moved? Where did these come from? These came from there's someone called Blair McCallum, who wrote this book called Journey to Lean, who's a lean practice expert in the London office of McKinsey, and John Dowdy, who's runs one of the parts of the industrial group in McKinsey. Apparently had a conversation with John Dowdy where John claimed that I can walk into a factory And within 20 minutes, I can tell you that it's well managed or not. And John seemed a bit skeptical and kind of challenged him. And he said, look, I can write down this grid and you can use it to evaluate companies. And that grid became part of a tool that was used for McKinsey initially to do evaluation of companies. And it's the same grid we're going to use when we do telephone interviews. So what we collect data from is 45-minute telephone interviews of senior managers who are typically not the CEO, but pretty senior in their company. So CEOs are hard to get on the phone. It's not always clear they know exactly what's going on. In a sense, lower managers maybe are too disconnected. We want senior managers. How do we get firms to participate? I'm going to show you data from about 35 countries. One of the things is we introduce it as a management interview. So we're not going to ask for any financial data. If I ring up a firm, ask them for financial data, they might be worried that I'm going to send the data to Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or someone. So we only ask about management information. For most firms outside the US, we can get financial information from somewhere else. So in the Europe, public and private firms can get financials for. We also have these endorsement letters. This is one up here, I think it's from the Bank of Japan. It's from the governor of the Bank of Japan. We had endorsement letters from various places. My favorite was always the one from the Bundesbank. So the Bundesbank endorsement letter had this big black eagle on the top of it. And we'd fax this letter through to the German managers, and they'd see like the imperial eagle. And it was like amazing compliance. In Southern Europe, it almost went the other way around. So in Greece, we had letters from the Greek government, but they didn't trust their own government. They actually rather the letters from the European Union, which is like, no, at that point anyway, when we were running the interviews. And then, in America, Americans don't tend to trust government very much. So letters from the government were not that helpful in America, institutional names. So people would ring up and say, I'm calling as they work from Stanford University or Harvard University. And then finally, how do we get double-blind or reliable information? So imagine I'm interviewing Marianne in her company. So she's, Lindner Plastics, let's say. I would tell her in advance that in advance, I don't know the company's performance. So we're going to randomly pick companies between 100 to 5,000 employees. We exclude the very largest multinationals because most people, before you pick the phone up, have a pretty good sense of whether they're well managed. So if you pick up the phone to call Walmart, you probably have pretty strong priors. Below 100, they get too small to compare across countries. So the interviewers don't know the score of the manager, the performance of the firm in advance. And we wouldn't tell Marion we're scoring her. So we'd tell her we're doing an interview. We want to talk to her about management in her firm. How would that work? So here's one of the early questions. I'd say, comes about 5 minutes in. So I'd say, Marion, how is performance tracked in your business? And one of the things is to ask open questions, which are questions that don't have a yes/no answer. So do you track performance as a yes/no? It's called a closed question. It's very easy to lead. Open questions don't have explicit answers. And it's when I was at McKinsey, we were trained to do an interview. So if you're MBA students, one of the things you should get, when you go to interviews, people are very focused on open questions. So I'd ask an open question. How is performance tracked? If she's Toyota, she's like to tell me about a whole series of production display boards, continuous monitoring, a range of data tools. If she's some of the Indian companies I'll show you photos of in a minute that are pretty badly managed, she may say, look, I have data from my accounts I pull once a year. So, and I'd then say, imagine if I visited your factory floor, what could I see if I walked around? Can I tell metrics? A whole series of questions until I can evaluate her. Something from a dimension of 1, which is measures tracked don't directly indicate if business objectives are being met. Many processes aren't tracked at all. Up to a 5 out of 5, where everything is continuously tracked and communicated to all staff. So what are we looking at? So in pictures, we're really trying to evaluate in an unbiased way whether firms do things like this. So this is a picture of a Toyota plant. I visited quite a few Toyota, or various automotives. I visited actually a Toyota plant in Nagoya in Japan, and a number of their suppliers like Denso. And if you walk around the factories, you'll see a lot of this, which is display boards at every single part of the production process. So it's very easy for a manager or for a worker to see how they're doing. And it's worth noting, this isn't high tech. It's not like it's loads of computer equipment, but it's a very basic fundamental practice about measuring what's going on. So we're trying to get an idea of whether this goes on. Here's another example from healthcare. A bit later, I'm going to show you some data from hospitals. This is from Virginia Mason, which is a very successful hospital in Seattle. There's a Harvard Business Review case study about them that I teach. It's won multiple awards. Virginia Mason is famous for adopting lean practices around healthcare. This is what's called Tuesday stand-up. So every Tuesday, in orthopedics, the head of the team goes through, in this case with his team, going through a whole series of data to try and understand process problems, what's worked, what hasn't worked. Again, very, very data-driven. This is Seatrip. Have we got any Chinese students here? Does any of the Chinese students recognize Seatrip? Have you used it? Yeah. So Seatrip is Seatrip's China's largest travel agency. Their co-founder and, well, at that time chairman, but previous CEO, was actually in my class at Stanford, so I went out to visit him in his headquarters out in Shanghai. And they're incredibly successful. They're like Expedia in China, apart from their market share was back then it was like 50%. So they're very, very successful Expedia. And when you walk around the office, they have just reams of data, like incredibly impressive amounts of measurement all over the place, display boards. This is a hotel. This is a Marriott hotel. I went to the American Economics Association meetings at Christmas, and I popped into a side room. This is my co-author, Eric Bryn-Jolson, decided to have a meeting. It was very noisy outside, so we popped into a side room. Turned out we popped into the metrics room. So we were there, and I took one photo of that metric, and then at that point, one of the managers came in and said, what are you doing in this room? And we told them we were like management nerds. We're really interested, really impressed. He started explaining. He was very proud of his metrics. He wouldn't actually let us take a photo of the other wall. The other wall was actually much more interesting. So the other wall was the incident wall. And the top thing was VIP guests. So this was the American Economics Association. So at the event, there's like Larry Summers, Jay Powell was there, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen. In fact, I'm on the AA exec, and it's very odd. The current head of the AA executive is Ben Bernanke, and the president-elect is Janet Yellen. So we get to spend a day like sitting in this room talking about journal pricing. I'm sure they've dealt with more serious events, but right below that, the second incident was drunken guest. So I was assuming by the proximity it wasn't Larry Summers that was seen drunken around it. But again, in hotels, they try and measure everything. I don't want to claim that every firm is well managed. So I've spent quite a lot of time out in India doing randomized control trials and management practices. I'm not going to talk about this today, but working with the World Bank and trying to get effectively gold standard data on the impact of management. So raised many millions of dollars. We've got a sample of firms who randomly got a censure to go in and work with some of them, not others. In the same way you test drugs for the treatment and control and then track them over time. This was one of the treatment firms beforehand. If you visit factories in India, this is kind of quite often pretty standard. So lots of stuff lying around the factory floor, very disorganized. Here's another photo. There's a toolkit lying there. There was no one around. When I found this, you couldn't see anyone anywhere nearby. So someone's decided to repair a piece of equipment. Halfway through, they've got distracted, wandered off. The next person that goes to look for the wrench, it's missing. This was, very, very common. So the other thing we ask about, the second half of the grid I mentioned towards the end is about incentives. So I might ask, this is a 45-minute interview. So towards the end, I'll be asking Marianne, so now I want to ask you, how does the promotion system work? And I let her talk for a while. And then at some point, I'd say, imagine two people joined the firm 3 years ago, and one was clearly a higher performer than the other. What would be the likely trajectory? And let her talk for a while. And after a sense, you can score after a few more questions on 1, where promotion is primarily on the basis of tenure, up to 5, where you talk about we actively identify and develop and promote our top performers. So again, another example of that might be this. So this is some slides from one of my MBA students. She was quite a senior manager in a very large and successful bank, retail bank, that this was a South American branch. And I asked her to explain how she promoted people in her team. And she said, it's entirely data driven. So for each of the team, the lights are going down. Maybe that's data driven, I don't know. So she said when she promotes people in her team, she does it entirely on, as much as she can on metrics. So she looks at a huge number of metrics for each person, looks at month by month. Basically, you want to get the sense that we're trying to measure that people have been promoted based on performance and ability and not on other things like tenure or even worse, on discrimination. So we've collected data now across countries for 20,000 firms. So here's the survey rooms. Here's a wave we did in 2004. So we try and collect data out of the London School of Economics in multiple waves. London turns out to be a great location to do this. It's in a good time zone. It's easy to get lots of people speaking different languages. There's actually even a YouTube video. Here's my co-author, Raphael Seguin, presenting it. I noticed embarrassingly yesterday, It only has 387 views. So, you know, we can double that now, actually, if you just all, in fact, if you like the video at the end of it, just click refresh many times and you can, you know, maybe it can get trending on you. But there is a video. It's actually a very well-made video. I think our marketing is terrible rather than actually the video is terrible. And there's also a website, if you're interested, that has a lot of the underlying research. I'm going to talk for 30, 40 minutes, but there's a lot more material underlying it. So why don't I go through some of the basic facts? So first, you know, maybe not surprisingly, but you know, I guess I don't need to say this in a business school, but I have to say, interacting with policymakers, this isn't always the general consensus. Management practices has a massively strong positive relationship, and in the RCT work, causal relationship on performance. So we take our management scores, which remember are based on monitoring. So do you collect information, use it to improve performance? Targets, do you have good targets? Are they binding? And incentives, do you reward good performers and deal with underperformers? We generate that into a composite score by firm. So on each one of those questions, it goes to 1 to 5, and firms can be averaged. And then we put firms into deciles, so bottom to top 10%. And you can see at the top left, productivity is massively higher for well-managed firms. You know, the top 10% are roughly 75% more productive than the bottom 10%. That means they produce 75% more output from the same inputs. So if you just thought of growth for the US, imagine you took one group, the bottom 10% up to the top 10%, they're going to produce 75% more from the same inputs. That's an enormous amount of increase in growth. So in a period where we're looking for growth and US growth is declining, you can see the numbers here are just huge. Just simple, you know, small changes in management practices can generate enormous changes in growth. Profits, output growth, so badly run firms are actually shrinking pretty fast, well-run firms are growing. Exports, and then importantly, R&D per employee and patents per employee. I was at an event in Washington about 10 years ago, and there was a big National Academy of Sciences discussion about management practices. And the person before me actually was Google. Google was talking about how it does its innovation. And it was interesting. They said, look, we have blue skies innovation, these big picture things. Then we have very minute-by-minute innovation, which is basically increasing the speed and accuracy of search. And for the latter in particular, we're very focused on metrics. And this is very consistent. I came to talk next in the Google side. This is very consistent with what we think. So there's some kind of view that chaos generates innovation and creativity. And generally, it just doesn't seem to be the fact. Well-run, well-managed firms seem to be much more creative and much more innovative. So that's fact one. I want to push this a bit further, which is to say, well-managed firms also use less energy. So maybe, you know, that seems to possibly surprising, but well-managed firms are more energy efficient and are more environmentally friendly. Why is that? Well, well-managed firms focus on reducing waste. They focus on maximizing profit. So to give you an example, when I visited Denso, Toyota's #1 supplier out in Japan, and walked around their factory floor, they were telling us, there's a group of us, academics were going around, all the innovations they made, and they were focused entirely, frankly, on making money, on reducing costs. But they were doing things like rooms where the lights were sensitive, whether you were in or out, relocating the factory floor so that material moved as little as possible. They had something for molding spark plugs. They drilled holes to reduce the amount of heat they used. All kinds of little innovations that collectively meant that well-managed firms tend to be much more energy efficient. And so again, I think in terms of environmental impact, if you're well-managed, you tend to be more efficient. Secondly, what about across countries? This is the graph I can more easily present. I hope you can hear I'm British rather than Australian or a New Zealander or something. I'm not. My wife's a Scots, so she definitely. I should say English actually. She'd sound very different from me. So I am naturalized now, so I'm a dual national, but I still kind of, I don't know. I support England when it comes to football. That's for sure. It's a weird thing in my household as to which of my, what nationality my kids have. But certainly, if you look at this chart, this is manufacturing, and actually, I think if anything, that probably does a disservice to the US, because I think in, for example, financial services, it'll be even more starved. But in manufacturing, which remember is not traditionally, at least not now, seen particularly as America's strongest industry, or at least relatively its strongest industry. If you look at manufacturing, American firms on average are the best managed in the world. So to give you a sense, this is a grid that takes, in America, we have about 1,000 firms. We've averaged, each firm has a score of 1 to 5. We've taken an average of it. American firms on average, the best managed. Japanese, German, Swedish firms are pretty close. as you go down this world ranking of Great Britain, my homeland, pretty good. But you know, as you scroll down, France, Australia, you go basically from US, North America, you head into Southern Europe, Latin America, Central America, towards the bottom, you go down to Africa. Now, you know, one observation for anyone that's an immigrant that's lived abroad, I mean, I have to say personally, I just noticed America is incredibly efficient. Even when I go back to the UK and I spend time in London, the UK is pretty high up there. There's just lots of little things. American firms are just very impressive and very efficient. And we kind of see that. Many of the most successful multinationals around the world are also American multinationals. So I think it's a reflection of this. You go down to the bottom, I don't know how many people have spent time with firms in Africa, but the situation here is, you know, pretty depressing in the sense that there's very little data collected, so there's no sense of monitoring and feedback systems. Typically, there aren't any targets, or there may be one single annual target that's often, you know, too easy or too hard. And on incentives, it's typically promotion by tenure or promotion by family connection. As a result, these firms score very lowly. Now, as much as I think America can do well in terms of growth by improving its management practices, the opportunities in some ways even greater in developing countries. So I'm not going to talk that much more about it, but one of the offshoots for this, in a sense connected actually to the Nobel Prize that was given this week, in fact, the beginning of this week, to Michael Kramer, Abhijit Banerjee, and Esther Duflo, is the idea that we should try and work on firms in developing countries to improve growth. And through growth comes wealth and development. So thirdly, there's also a wide spread across firms within countries. So I've highlighted two countries, the US and India. I picked, you know, I don't mean, you know, I'd pick on India because I've been out there a lot. I've been out there many times to do field work out in India. So I know the situation well, and the US is a natural comparator. I want to point out, US average scores are good because the US doesn't have that much of a tail of badly run firms. If you're badly run in America, you tend to either improve or exit. Wages are high, it's difficult to do business, it's an expensive place to operate. Badly run firms in America shape off or exit. If you look in India, you see this huge tail of firms on the left side. And the dynamic there is it's actually quite easy to continue to be reasonably badly managed if you're paying workers, you know, $10, $20 a day. If regulation, or, you know, regulations, it's not clear how much of them are obeyed. There's also a bunch of great Indian firms on the right-hand side. So I don't want to say all Indian firms are bad. There's companies like Tata Alliance that are kind of world leaders and in fact bought up many British firms. More the stylized factors, you know, well-managed countries tend to achieve that by chopping off the left tail. In America, that left tail is driven up. And then finally, we've been looking at different sectors. So we've done 4 sectors in detail: manufacturing, retail, schools, and hospitals. If you remember the questions I showed you earlier, they didn't really talk about, so I didn't tell you what industry I was intending to interview Marianne about. All of those questions about why do you promote people, how do you measure stuff, what's the feedback system, they're all very generic. So in fact, of the 18 questions, 14 are identical across sectors. The other 4, we've changed the word factory for school or hospital. And they work really very well. There are some other questions in healthcare that we work with the McKinsey healthcare practice to add, but basically there's a core of this survey that's identical across sectors. And you can see the distribution across sectors. Here's shown for the US. And one stylized fact we find is that hospitals, and particularly schools, have significantly lower management practice scores. So much of this difference is not in monitoring and targets. So the public sector is often quite good at collecting data, setting targets. The big gap turns out to be typically around incentives. So the public sector in particular has real issues about getting rid of underperformers. And to give you 2 anecdotes, I had an undergrad I teach an undergrad management class, and I get all of the undergrads to score a firm they know using this grid. And so they often score their parents or summer job placements or gap year things. And one of them, he'd worked in Costco, and he'd worked over the summer 2 years in a row. So he'd spent 6 months working there. And he told me a story about Costco, which was actually sounds ruthless, but it was very impressive about Costco. He said, my second summer, while I was there, they had a new manager came in. And in the first month, she had a poor performance review. They told her to improve. Second month, she had a poor performance review. They told her to improve again. Third month, she had a poor performance review, and she was exited out of the firm. So in some senses, that seems ruthless. In the other sense, you know, they got someone in and reviewed her 3 times and got her out again in the space of 3 months. And that's, you know, you can see how that's going to drive performance of organizations. And it's essentially, you could even argue, good for the individual. No one wants to be in an agency where they're, where they're underperforming. The other extreme, I have the principal of Palo Alto High School, which is like one of the most, on exam grades, high-performing schools. I don't know where it ranks, but it's probably in the top 100. You went there. It's an amazing school, the best. I saw your dad was a GSB. When were you in Palo Alto High School? Wow. Okay. This is like some kind of Quentin Tarantino movie. It's all going to connect up. Well, I'm glad. I hope you're not fact checking me on this. I at least know Kim Dorio, she's now. I mean, Palo Alto High School, because being the principal of the high school must be the worst job, because Palo Alto is has to be a collection of the most pushy parents, and so the principals churn in and out at some incredible speed. But anyway, I mean, I'm sure that there's the same issues in Cincinnati. I don't know if my kid's school district, but so Kim Doria, who's only been there for like 3 years and was kicked out. She came twice to teach my she came to talk to my undergraduates 2 years in a row, and it was really fascinating. She said it's just a nightmare getting rid of underperforming teachers. It takes up to 5 years. I have to go through multiple tribunals. She said often what I do is it's so painful is I get them to teach a really unpopular subject so they can damage as few pupils as possible. So she said one recent one, they got them to talk Byzantium history because no one's basically interested in Byzantium history. So there's only one kid in the class. But that tells you that is the public sector, So the public sector often is good at monitoring and targets. Has a real problem with dealing with underperformance, In part, I want to blame regulations and partly, to be honest, union interference. So what about management inequality? As you know, the top 1% are getting increasingly rich. There's a big concern about rising inequality. This graph in the black line is the numbers from Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Sartre, got this the wrong way around, which is the share of income going to the top 1%. And you notice it was very high about 100 years ago. It dropped, and then since the early 70s, inequality in the US has been continuing to rise. Now, the story 100 years ago is really quite different. Most of this was the super rich earned their money mainly from capital, so they had large businesses that made capital gains and they sold the shares or earned dividends. So it's a lot of people like this. Don't recognize who that is? Sorry? Ford, yeah, Ford. No, okay, this is Rockefeller. This one, if anyone gets this one, I'll be very impressed. Nobody? Sorry? No, almost, even in Stanford, this is actually Leyland Stanford. So Leyland Stanford is one of the big four that financed the railroad that basically connected the US, and then one of the others was one of the Wells Fargo creators, I think. So I put them up. Even the undergrads failed to ever notice Leyland Stanford. Although the summit, 20 years ago, there's this joke going around that Leyland Stanford Day looks identical to Walt from The Big Lebowski. We just put on sunglasses. So I put them up. These were the source of massive wealth 100 years ago. These are people whose income did not come in their W-2 form. It basically came in dividends and capital gains. Nowadays, the top 1% generally look quite different. It's much more people who've earned income on their W-2. If you look at who they are, they're heavily composed of 4 groups. One is professionals, so lawyers, accountants, I guess consultants. The second group is sportsmen, sportswomen. They're actually so large, they're significant numbers in the top, particularly the top 0.1%. There's Wall Street. I put up Gordon Gekko. I didn't want to kind of put any individual up. And then finally, entertainers. So here's Katy Perry with my brother Orlando. I was hoping that maybe someone would fall for this, but so I'm going to write, these numbers are kind of truly amazing. I'm going to skip this to focus on management. So what about management inequality? So there's been a claim that aggressive management enriches managers, raising inequality. So, Jack Welch, I know, has a Cincinnati connection. He has a very modestly titled book called Winning. And then there's Mitt Romney on the right. I quite like Mitt Romney, actually. He's one of my kind of favorite politicians. I put him up here because he got a lot of bad press around the time the election before last when he was running because of his involvement in Bain Capital. So as an economist, we're like huge fans of private equity. They're the kind of the dynamos of the economy. But at the same time, they were blamed for increasing inequality. So the question is this true? I need a different data set here. So we've persuaded or raised funding to work with the US Census Bureau to run a massive management survey in the US. So the US Census surveys establishments every year. In 2010 and 2015, they sent out this reasonably short, but basically based on what I've shown you before, management survey to 50,000 manufacturing plants. They have a huge sample of 100,000 plants that were given us management data. And we've matched this up to the LEHD. So that's the individual tax returns of roughly 10 million people working over these establishments over time. So the question is, do better managed firms have more or less inequality? My prior was, the kinds of things we saw in the management practices, the aggressive bonuses, the aggressive performance monitoring. Sure, it improves performance, and it's nice it reduces environmental emissions, but possibly the downside is it increases inequality. So weirdly enough, and I have to say this is very much work in progress, we don't find evidence for that at all. We find evidence actually in the data. I mean, I've shown you what are called bin scatters, but underlying this aggression there are millions of data points. Actually, firms that are adopting aggressive structured management practices, the types of things I'm talking about, have lower 90/10s, the gap between the 90th and 10th percentile pay inequality within their firm. So well-managed firms have lower within firm inequality. Why is this? Well, maybe one story is, well, look, we're not comparing apples to apples. It's like differences in industry or region or size, et cetera, et cetera. I won't bore you with it, but it turns out that's not the case. Whatever you control for in these regressions, it's still the case. Well-managed firms has less inequality. So, why is that? It seems a kind of puzzling finding. Well, there's two things going on. One is, I can show you in this somewhat complicated graph. So this is the management score for our firms. It's on a different scale because it's the census data. It goes from about 0.3, which is really dreadful management practices, up to 1, which almost nobody has, but that will be extremely aggressive monitoring, very heavy targets, very strong incentives. And what I've shown here is the pay in red to the 90th percentile. That would be a manager as the management score improves. And what you can see, roughly speaking, is as the management score improves, the 90th percentile managers, their pay goes up. On the y-axis, you can see it doesn't go up a lot. So going from a terribly managed firm up to a pretty well-managed firm, controlling for a size and other factors, their management score goes up by about 6 or 7%. In yellow is the 50th percentile. That's more like a skilled worker. That goes up a much higher amount, goes up about 15%. And at the 10th percentile, that's towards the bottom of the firm. That goes up almost 20%. So what's this telling us? It's telling us, I have to say, against my prior and somewhat surprisingly, in well-managed firms that make more profits, they seem to be sharing increasing proportion of that with lower earning workers and higher earning workers. So sure, the managers, in particular the CEOs, do extremely well, but there seems to be evidence in the micro data for quite a good degree of profit sharing throughout the firm. So what I skipped to say, that was another firm. So where am I now? So what have we summarized? The US has fantastic management practices. It's associated with better performance, it's associated with lower emissions, and I'd say very much work in progress. I don't find management leads to higher inequality. If anything, it seems to reduce it. So we're on board for trying to improve management. How might we go about it? Well, one thing is, why aren't all firms badly well managed? Why don't firms figure it out themselves? But I think it's like that challenge of that question, that famous question, is your child above, equal, or below average intelligence? And apparently like 90% of people say their kid's above average intelligence. So it's just very hard to self-assess. So at the end of our world management survey, we ask a question, excluding yourself, how well managed would you say your firm is? A scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is worst practice, 5 is average, and 10 is best practice. And you know exactly where this is heading. You can tell it's heading to this. So, our firms all claim to be kind of 8 or 9 out of 10s. There's no, these are the people who are below average. Like 2% of firms claim to be below, basically no one claims to be below average. Every firm thinks it's either at or above average, basically above average in management. And then you think, well, maybe they're all overconfident. They know roughly where they are. So we also plot their score against performance. And it's what we call the shotgun blast. There's just no correlation. So it turns out it's actually just really hard for firms to assess how good or how badly managed they are. And in fact, coming back to Lindner, I think it's one of the huge benefits of business schools is for executives and managers to come in and talk to other people in classes and go through case studies and discuss and get some sense of relatively where they are. It's very hard, you find from interviewing people, to assess when you're in your firm day to day how good you are. When you get out and talk to other people in other firms, it tends to be really valuable. And so if you're interested, we have a self-assessment tool on, you can go and get your own management score on our website. So that's self-assessment. It seems to be hard. So if you wanted to, do something on policy, one angle, which I know is very topical in Ohio, is regulation. So there's a big debate about right to work. It turns out in the data, right to work rules, which are kind of pro-business, anti-union laws, turn out to be associated with significantly better management practices, particularly incentive practices. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but one graph we can show is we group all our states across the US, and we look at plants that are near borders that are either side of right to work. So take California, it's not a right to work state. Nevada is a right to work state. We look at plants that are close to the California-Nevada border. We have enough of them, thousands and thousands of them across multiple borders to try and evaluate their management score. And what you see is, on the right to work side of the border, the plants have significantly better management scores, particularly in incentive practices. As soon as you cross over, say, into California from Nevada, the management practices drop down. There's another number of other tests we do that looks like lighter regulation, i.e. right to work, is associated with better management practices. Here's a map of the US. Ohio is kind of right in the battleground now. There's a number, I can't remember, I think Indiana, I believe Indiana, Michigan have gone right to work. West Virginia, I think, has gone right to work. This map is maybe now slightly out of date, but you can see here are the right to work states outlined in dark. Here's the management score. Interestingly enough, a lot of the best managed states across the country turn out to be in the South, to some extent, this middle belt. These are the less regulated counties, the states. They're also the states that are attracting a lot of multinationals. Embarrassingly, California looks pretty dreadful on this map. So remember, this is manufacturing, but this is another indicator that I think regulations matter. Multinationals, so another factor is on multinationals. We look at multinationals. We use analysis of what's called million-dollar plants. We look at big plants that open up and compare the counties they open up to the ones that they decided not to. So here's this newspaper story about Toyota Corporation. It said one of the Southeast's most prized catches of the year landed in Huntsville, Alabama, where the Japanese automaker Toyota Corporation announced that it located a $200 million plant. Huntsville beat out Clarksville, Tennessee, and Buffalo, West Virginia. And so we have a couple of hundred of these type of examples, and we can compare the changes in management practices in the counties that multinational went into versus, in this case, the ones that missed out, Clarksville and Tennessee. And the short answer is, these multinationals seem to not only be well managed themselves, but spill out great practices around. And finally, I want to end on ownership. A final factor driving better management practice seems to be ownership, in particular, professional ownership. So if you look, this is management scores ranked by owner. If you look down at the bottom, a lot of family-owned, which is in second, third generation inherited companies that have family CEOs, on average are not as well managed. If you look at the top, we tend to see publicly listed companies, those owned by private equity, or those family-owned that have a non-family CEO. So that, for example, would be Walmart. So Walmart is mostly, the biggest owners are the Walton family, but they have a non-family CEO. So part of improving management practices is trying to professionalize management. And again, I think this is an important role for business schools. It's about trying to professionalize managers, have a cadre of professional managers that move around the firm. So before I end, I want to show you some quotes. So the quotes are like, if you've interviewed 20,000 firms, you've had to ring up 40,000 firms, you can't believe quite what they say on the phone. The first one, I should say, is backdrop. My dad, both my sisters, my father-in-law all work in, many of my family work in the NHS. I'm thick with it. I'm like the only I'm a fake doctor. I have a PhD, I guess, but I'm the only non-proper doctor in my household. So we have a question in the UK, we have a question in the management grid, which is about match of skills to jobs. We don't have it in the manufacturing. I haven't talked to you, but we asked them, do staff sometimes end up doing the wrong sort of work for their skills? And one of the NHS managers said, do you mean like doctors doing nurses' jobs and nurses doing porter jobs? Yes, all the time. Last week, we had to get the healthier patients to push around the beds for the sicker patients. So if you're ill in London, go straight to Heathrow and leave. It's, it's not great. And then this is a fantastic quote in India. So when we're doing the hospital interviews, you have three types of hospitals. There's for profit, there's not for profit, like Sutter Healthcare, for example, my local hospital in California. And then there's government, like the Veterans Administration. And we asked them, is this hospital for profit or not? And the respondee very honestly said, oh no, this hospital is only for loss making, which I thought. And then I think similarly, don't get sick in India. So when we run the management interview, we want to make sure for the hospitals we're comparing like for like. So we want to make sure we're interviewing a hospital that has an emergency room, has orthopedics and cardiology. So not like, you know, some strange sports clinic or something. So we asked, you offer acute care, which is the Indian phrase for emergency room. Switchboard said, yes, ma'am, we do. Do you have an orthopedic department? They said, yes, ma'am, we do. What about a cardiology department? Yes, ma'am. So great, they're in sample. So at that point, they're trained to connect to the orthopedics department as the source to make it as comparable as possible. Great, can you connect me to the orthopedic department? At which point they replied, sorry, ma'am, I'm a patient here. It turned out we come through to like a bedside phone. I don't quite know that. And then my final two quotes, one on Europe and one on America. So Europe, people often find it very difficult to define ownership in Europe. So I don't know if you remember that Parmalat company, that food company, that enormous scandal. There's the vast amount of pyramiding, and nobody really knew who owned the company. And like apparently Berlusconi owned part of it, but then no one could really tell. So this was an interviewer in Europe who's extremely honest. They said production manager. They just said we're owned by the mafia. There was no beating about. An interviewer fantastically said, I think that's the other category. Although I guess we could put you down as an Italian multinational. And then finally, everyone knows Americans' weak point is geography. So we asked somebody, how many production sites do you have abroad? And the manager in Indiana said, well, we have one in Texas, which I think still isn't abroad. I know at one point it was. So I'm going to conclude, you know, we can measure management practices across firms and countries. You find a huge spread. You know, we should be extremely, it's easier for me to say this with this accent, but we should be extremely proud. The US firms are typically the best managed in the world. America, you know, is the home to fantastic, you know, world-leading management. Better management's a huge driver of productivity and growth. You know, I don't know how much you know, but of countries with more than 10 million employees, Americans are on average the richest by some margin. I think it's in no small part of the fact that companies are significantly better managed. And finally, good management seems to reduce inequality. It's less obvious, that's still work in progress, but I don't see any evidence, certainly, that it's bad for inequality. So, you know, is management the answer? I'm not sure it's entirely the answer, but I want to be, you know, very positive. We should celebrate great managers rather than beating them up in the press. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, wonderful talk.
Yes. For an economist, that's, you know.
Like this. And once the red light come on, you can ask a question.
So first of all, thanks a lot for great talk. I have two possibly quick questions. And the first one was that, like, I was kind of unclear how do you define a well-managed firm? Is it about like monitoring like the data really well, being in touch with what's a good or like well-deserved promotion or not, or whether the floor is clean? Like, what is the criteria? And the second one was that I understood that the main argument in this presentation was that the well-managed firms actually lower inequality, right? Or like don't cause inequality at least, right? But I was kind of unclear how you can make the argument, like how do you scale up from this company doesn't cause inequality within the firm to like, oh, the whole country is not having a problem with inequality if every firm is well managed. Thank you.
Two great. So second is a great, why don't I answer the first one? It's much easier. The second one's a much harder question. You're right. So on the first one, you know, business school, if you look at like what's classically taught in the business school, there are six things. It's like operations, HR, strategy, marketing, finance, and sometimes technology. I mean, 5.5 maybe. So we basically picked the first two, operations and HR, and turn them into grid. I should say we didn't do it. McKinsey did this. So, economists don't know that, anything, to be honest, about management. We took their grid and used it. So that doesn't reply. I'm being very narrow about economists. I'm not talking about any other social science. Economists are kind of famously bad about management anyway. So we took those two dimensions, and it's also true, it's a hypothesis whether that is good or bad. So just to be clear, what we're defining as good, and in fact my co-authors are probably more careful than I am, but we're defining good as if you monitor a lot and use it to continuously improve the performance, which is driven very much by Toyota's Lean. So if you think of Lean and Six Sigma, it's highly correlated with that. And then in HR, it's really like American HR. It's aggressive, but also merit-based promotion, performance renewal system. So, you promote good employers. When I was at McKinsey, that's how it operated. We were evaluated pretty rapidly. I thought it was a very fair system. I didn't have any problems with that. So that's what we define as good. And that turns out to be highly correlated with, performance and growth. I don't think that, so that's the definition of it. Just to be clear, we haven't asked anything about strategy or finance or marketing or technology. Mainly because it's harder, and I'm doing some stuff on that now, but it's less obvious what's right or wrong. It's actually quite hard to define. On the way over on the plane, I was reading an interesting paper in finance about why there's a bunch of firms with no debt, which seems, if you believe the debt tax shield, is a kind of weird thing to do. And have they made a mistake or not? It's hard for us to judge it. On the second question, inequality, you're exactly right. I was most tentative, and this is very much like work in progress, but we can show that management isn't associated with an increase in inequality within firms. So I'd flip it around and say, if you're very against good management, say, well, it's Dickensian, it generates huge amounts of inequality, it's the managers stealing from the workers, you'd expect to see some of that within firms. We just don't see that within firms. And that's also true. Well-managed firms may outperform badly managed firms, and you get an increase in between firm inequality. We can't really talk about that. And the US does in general have quite high levels of inequality. My personal view is, if you want to fix that, you should have people well managed, and maybe through the tax system or ultimately education. It's not. I think beating up managers is not the way to go. You're kind of treating the symptom. But you're right. That's research. I have a much weaker statement on that. So that is research. Okay, so why are Indian firms? So again, I don't want to pick an Indian. I mean, across the developing world, there's a lot of. I mean, even in the UK, there's a left tail. It's just thinner. So when you interview these, I don't think they're aware they're badly managed. So if you go out to India and you spend time with the factory owners, they're extremely busy. They're doing lots of things. I mean, part of the problem is they have massive overstretch. So they're trying to run too many things. They're not focusing on their business. They're often running, multiple different parts of other business. I think it's just that they're not actually aware they were in the World Bank. We did a big randomized control trial. So we got 28 firms and randomized half of them to get help, and essentially about half didn't. The half that got help dramatically improved after the event. We're very happy. So they kept adopting the practices. I think and if you went back 100 years, the British firms, they're pretty dreadful. American firms 100 years ago. So I honestly think it's a cognition issue. This is, again, why I'm a big fan of business education, of benchmarking, of trying to share skills. There used to be these demonstration projects whereby, in agriculture, the way they best practice in agriculture is the agricultural extension program. They'd set up these model farms, this is 100 years ago, and they'd get farmers in, they'd see how successful it was, and they'd copy it. And then why are American firms better? I think America has, is much more competitive. America has a huge advantage of having a big, open, competitive market. Unfortunately, European Union's about to get a lot less competitive because Britain, it's just terrible, but even within the EU, there's a lot of regulation. The US is one large competitive market. It's lightly regulated. Americans are still pretty well educated. Their advantage is falling back, but there's a lot of, and because of that, they tend to be well managed. And the other thing that drives American firms to be well managed is the wage rate is high. So if you're not well managed, you're going to lose money. So, I mean, that's a kind of general equilibrium effect. But you just don't survive in America being that. Not for long, anyway. I mean, there are some left-tail firms in the US. They typically are often family-owned or serving, the government. There's some niche they're in that protects them. Yes. Right. It's a great question. So I skipped if I was giving an academic presentation, like the middle third would be on validation. So the couple of things we do, so one is, for about 10%, we got a different interviewer to ring up a different person in a different plant. So if I show you the scatter plots, like a cloud of points going up. So, I rang you up and Devash, you rang up Marion in a different plant. The score across within the same firm, they tend to be correlated. They're not perfect. So there's clearly some noise. There are differences across plants, but there's also some noise. The other much tougher test is the performance stuff I show you is regressions of separately collected accounting data. So it's not like, remember the double blind man meant that if I had to ring you up to run an interview, before I rang you up, I've not looked at your performance data at all. So I don't know whether you're profitable or not, or growing fast or slow. We collect all the data, we put it into a database, and we match it against company performance data, and lo and behold, they're very correlated. That still doesn't mean it's causal, because there are still, even with that, there are problems. You could be doing well, you're really happy, I pick it up on the phone. So that's partly why we did the field experiments. So field experiments are very, we raised like $3 million and have to work with the World Bank, but that's kind of the gold standard. So we went in there, took a bunch of firms, we literally flipped coins into treatment and control. The treatment guys got 4 months of essential. We put in practice those practices, the control didn't, we just tracked them solid through time. In some ways, it seems like proving the obvious. To most business people, it's obvious this stuff improves. But on the other hand, it's useful to get magnitudes. And Hanan's point, why didn't they do it earlier? You may think, well, they didn't do it because it didn't improve performance. It turns out it does. And so then you're like, well, why didn't? So there's a lot of methodological questions. I think the trickiest thing for us is the kind of cause and effect. I think we're basically measuring the noise. I agree it's not perfect and there's some bias, but through the large samples and some of the procedures we try to clear up surveys. There's a question of that. Normally I never get questions from the back in this class. There's always the guys like on Facebook. Well, I guess Instagram. Yes, yeah.
Okay, so I was curious, from your research, is there any relationship between the quality of a company's management and how generous they are with benefits? So like greater paid time off or parental leave, or, even most importantly, free food?
Again, this is like my research live being mapped out in like 8 questions here. So I just didn't put it up, but another big project we've been working on, aside from working from home that we discussed earlier, was work-life balance in general. So what you find is, so we can survey employees both on hard and soft things. So hard things is, for example, are you allowed to job share? Are you allowed to work from home? If your child is sick, are you allowed to take time off? And it goes from varies from no to yes, I have to take it out of holiday to yes, and I can take it to my sick leave. And then there's another question we asked them about how you feel your work-life balance is. It turns out there's a very strong positive correlation. Again, my experience with just talking to people through surveys, and also actually honestly from my MBA students, well-managed firms tend to be profitable, tend to be successful, and can allow that bit of flexibility if somebody's kid's sick to let them stay at home. Badly managed firms tend to be chaotic, and it's organized, they struggle to keep up with stuff. They tend to put everyone into the office and make them work from house. So at least I don't have a causal story, the correlation is, I don't know about free food. I didn't ask about free food. In fact, in the musical, when I worked at McKinsey, we had free food. My first day at Stanford, we went for lunch in the business school with all my colleagues. And I picked up my food and I was out at the table and I was waiting for ages. And I was like, where were you guys? And they said, well, there was like a big queue to pay for the food. And I said, it's not free. So, I had free lunch on my first day, but after that. But in general, Inequality, I think, is our weakest evidence, but just come back to, the performance. I just see multiple gains from well managed. I said, yeah, I mean, maybe I'll come up with, I haven't seen anything that's really bad. So I worried about mistreating workers. That's another thing along with inequality. We just don't see evidence for that. They generally, at least in all the metrics we have, treat workers better.
Thank you.
So my question is about the global comparisons that you've made. So perceptions of what's considered good management practices and norming that across different cultures.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Japan, hours spent at work might be a proxy for productivity, whereas in the US, it might be quite the opposite.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating to see comparisons across countries. It's easy when they're affirming. So you see a factory floor in India, yeah, that's terrible management, right? But to what extent are those norms across countries taking into account some of these cultural contexts? I'm just curious.
Again, this is like a really, in fact, your question is very much like, oddly enough, years ago, a bunch of economists went to present to the Federal Reserve Board, and we all got asked one question, and Ben Bernanke more or less asked, I was like, what is Ben Bernanke asked me something about monetary policy, and he asked me about Japan, and, hours. So there are two ways to do it. So there's a big methodological issue for us. Back at the beginning, we decided we're going to use the same measure and apply it to all countries. So it's kind of like measuring height. So heights, Dutch, I think, the tallest in the world. We want to use the same ruler to measure everyone. And then, so for management, we started saying, look, we're going to use the same management grid across countries. We had issues of, so everyone was interested in their own native language. So by the way, in the UK, the biggest advantage is everyone into at least 2 or 3 countries. So everyone can speak English, isn't that even? And at least one other. So Nat, you saw a picture of her. Actually, she's in Japan. She's also fluent in English. So she was done Japan, the UK, the US. So we're on the same grid. Now the next question is that suitable? So one of the reasons we did the RCT in India is you may argue that in India there's a different legal environment. When I was out there, they talked about there's issues with corruption and officials coming to basically steal from the firm. Maybe you don't want to keep books. Then there's a reason not to collect data because if you have data, people turn up. So that was why we did the RCT. It turns out the firms are more profitable. The question is how much of that goes in their pocket. It's less obvious, but at least some performance. The next question is, across all countries, do improvements in management associate improvements in performance? That seems to be yes. Then the final question is, why does it vary? Some of it definitely is cultural. Some of it is regulatory. So I didn't show you a graph. If you look at strength of labor market regulations, that's highly correlated with the management score. Japan, interestingly, most people think it will be top. If you look at the monitoring part, it is the top country in the world. I mean, America copied leading from Japan. But the HR practices in Japan score a lot lower because of this tenure-based system, and they don't tend to fire up the performance. Is that bad? That's a more nuanced question. That's why they score lower. So part of the project I didn't go through was why are there these differences? And some of them are cultural, and some of them are regulatory. Like in France, a very strong labor laws. So our aim is methodologically, let's use the same measure across countries. Is that associated with performance across countries? It seems to be. Then try and explain the differences. And you're right, some of it is culture. Would I advise a Japanese firm to be aggressive in hiring and firing? That's a less obvious question. I'm not sure our data can actually, we need to run an RCT to be honest with you. I think we're at the edge of what our data can say on that question.
So my question is regarding the manufacturing plants and, for example, Toyota and the board. So is there a correlation between the board and how tight that company manages their employees or how, rigid they are and employee turnover? Or is that compensated by incentives? And then my second question is regarding China. Since they're right on our heels, how are they considered as far as management goes?
So in the first, it goes a lot with, I can't remember this. I'm not sure we've looked at turnover in part because it's been a hard variable to measure. We looked partly at pay and the work-life balance questions, and it turns out that better managed firms pay people more and they report higher work-life balance. I don't actually know on turnover. It's an odd thing to say. I'm not aware we've looked at it. We should look at it. Anecdotally, it seems that people are happier. I remember, when I've run these servers, I hired 50 people each summer to do it. My own personal experience, the thing that makes people really upset is they feel there's inequality in what's going on. So if I'm rewarding somebody $10 and someone else $5 for the same job, it sends them mad. So well-managed firms tend to be more equal because of the process and the system, and also it tends to push back actually on discrimination. So if any groups that feel they've been hard done by, if it's all by the numbers, it's much more transparent. But we should look at turnover. On the second, so I think it will probably be lower, but I don't know, mainly because they pay them more. On the second question, China looks quite low on this dimension. In fact, one question coming back to the Japan thing, another thing we do is look at multinationals in these countries. So I showed you there's a very steep slope from the US down to Africa. If you look at foreign multinationals located in that country, the slope is much shallower. So you may think, well, look, there's a Mozambique way of managing them. But if you look at P&G in Mozambique, they operate much the same way as they do in the US. And so it tells you also multinationals that have the choice to do stuff. So in China, the domestic companies don't look very good. The multinationals are actually pretty good. The reason I think China's successful is not that their management's great, it's worse. On this thing, it's clearly worse than American firms, is that their wage rates are low. And in fact, imagine you're a firm, what's the first best is take American management and cheap Chinese workers, and that's what offshoring, and that's more or less what's happening. So I think this is completely consistent with, market economics, that America has the best managers. They're sending these out all over the world in their multinationals. They just tend to be using labor often abroad because it's cheap.
Thank you.
That's not true. Well, thank you very much. I will pay you afterwards for this.
I agree with that definitely, and why people have that qualification from all the economics, I don't know. Maybe they need from them like Fulmer or people like them. They're also great entertainers. But what you get over here, the level of thought with those simple examples and stories is amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And